So, for thousands of years, people have wondered what wisdom is. How do they know things? Is it possible to even know things? And if it is possible to know things, where is the source of that knowledge? How can it be verified? There's a couple different ways traditionally to go about thinking about knowledge. So, imagine knowledge is at the top here of a hierarchy, and there are different branches of knowledge. The study of knowledge is also called epistemology. And epistemology, the study of what we know, how we can know things, if we can know anything at all, is basically broken into two different camps. There's rationalism on the one hand, and there's empiricism on the other. And let me just write this down here. So you have rationalism on the one hand, empiricism on the other. An example of a rationalist is a guy like Rene Descartes, and an example of an empiricist might be Thomas Hobbes. And so for rationalists, knowledge can come from thinking alone. You can just think and you can know that things are true. I like to call this armchair philosophy. Knowledge comes from thought. Whereas for a guy like Thomas Hobbes, knowledge comes from experience. In other words, it comes from our senses. And if you can't see it, if you can't touch it, if you can't taste it, then it doesn't exist. Okay. And these two schools of thought have been battling it out since time immemorial. I mean, this is an age-old debate. So why does this matter? Well, we talk about concepts like, I'll put lowercase g, God. When it comes to concepts like God, knowing God exists, the concept of God, Hobbes would say that you can only know God through your senses. And Descartes would say that you can know God exists through thinking and thought alone. So let's continue on here. So, for example, Rene Descartes, in terms of God, how does Descartes, a rationalist, prove that God exists? He does so just by thinking, and he can know so just by thinking. So for Descartes, you can just sit in a chair and know God exists. For example, let's see here. So God can be defined as a perfect thing or a perfect being. And what this means is that God is omniscient. That means all-knowing. God is omnipresent, which means everywhere. And God is omnipotent, which means all powerful. So these three things together make up the perfect being. So this idea is important for Descartes' rationalist argument for the existence of God. Because when he sits in his chair, I don't know if I can draw a chair here very well. It's going to be off center here. So when he sits in his chair, he can sit and reflect on this idea he has of perfect. And he looks around at the world with his senses, and he doesn't see anything that's perfect. He doesn't see, for example, a perfectly moral person. He doesn't see, for example, he looks at shapes and math. He's a mathematician. He doesn't see any examples of perfect circles. I mean, even if I, use some amazing draw tool, and let's imagine that's a perfect circle there. If you zoomed in on this, it would look pixelated, or it wouldn't be a perfect circle. So he's examining the because it's made up out of dots, or I mean, if you zoom in, it wouldn't look like a circle. And every circle's like this, even a circle in a math textbook. I mean, if you zoom right into it, it's going to look all dotted and pixelated and inky, and I'll have holes through it, and it won't look perfect. So he examines math, he examines morals and ethics, and he figures, well, I don't see anything that's perfect, yet this idea of perfect is in my head. So he thinks to himself, well, where does this idea of perfect come from? Because according to the empiricist, well, your senses don't reveal to you the truth about what perfect is. Your senses have never shown you what perfect is. So how can you have knowledge of this term, perfect, if your senses have never revealed to you what perfect is? You've never seen anything perfect. You've never tasted anything perfect. You've never met a perfectly moral person. So if all knowledge comes from your senses, and this is what empiricists believe, how is the idea of perfect in our minds? So in other words, for the empiricist, if you were born without any senses at all, you would know nothing. So if someone was born without, they couldn't see, they couldn't hear, they couldn't taste, they couldn't touch, they would have no ideas in their head. They would have no thoughts in their head whatsoever. For the rationalists, even if someone was born without any senses at all, they could still know things. because senses are not required to know things. Just thought is required to know things. And thought can happen for the rationalist independently of sensory input of the senses. So hopefully that makes sense there. So this is why these two schools of thought are so at odds with each other. So let's take this one step further now. So Descartes, this is also an argument against empiricism, not just an argument for God's existence, okay? Lowercase g God, so for the concept of God. Because there's this idea of perfect in our minds, and our senses have never showed us something perfect to base this concept on. So where does it come from? Where does it originate from? And Descartes concludes, to put it simply, that only something that is perfect can create the idea of perfection. So what does this mean? So in the same sense that you have an idea of heat in your mind, so something that's hot, like a fire or something, you got your fireplace with your logs and heat's coming up off of it. Only something that's hot itself can create then an idea of heat. Or something that's cold, like you have some ice cubes. Only something that is itself cold can create the idea of cold. So in other words, in order to have an idea, something that has a commensurate amount of reality as the idea of self, or even more commensurate reality, something real must have existed in order to have created that idea. So only something that is itself hot, like a stove or a frying pan or fire, could create the idea of heat in our minds at one time or another. So you may say, well, I've never experienced something hot, but I know what it is. Well, at some point, somebody experienced something hot, and they created the idea of heat, and they may have internalized this idea and taught it to you. So it doesn't mean that you yourself have to have experienced the idea. But someone at some point had to have experienced the idea to have this idea, had to have experienced something hot in order to have the idea of heat, in order to teach you what heat is, even though you yourself have never experienced this idea. So you can probably see where we're going here. Let me just clear the screen here. So if you need something that's actually hot to create a heat idea in your mind, or you need something cold, something that is actually cold, that exists in reality, like ice, like fire, to create a cold idea. Well, wait a second here. We have an idea of perfect in our head as well. So where does the idea of perfect come from? It can't just come from nothing. It has to come from something with a commensurate amount of reality as the idea itself. So only Descartes argues that only this idea of perfect, it has to come from something that actually exists that is itself perfect. So if you have an idea of perfect in your mind, this idea has to come from something that is itself perfect. Just like the idea of cold has to come from something that is itself cold. And the idea of heat has to come from something, a corporeal thing, that is itself hot. The same is true of the idea of perfect. If it's true of these two ideas, it must be true of all ideas. And perfect is an idea in your mind. So something that is itself perfect had to, at one point or another, create the idea of perfect. And this something is lowercase g, God. So a perfect being that's all powerful, that's all knowing, and that's everywhere, omnipresent. Okay, a perfect being. So now Descartes sitting in his armchair, and he can know that God exists, a perfect being, lowercase g, God. He starts wondering though, well, there's lots of other things that I don't really know. So, what about the existence of other people? It seems to him that other people exist and that they're like him and they're walking around and they have the same feelings as him and the same desires and other humans. But this could just be a trick, right? I mean, it could be the case that he is the only one really thinking, and everyone else are just, I mean, fancy robots or fancy, automatons or, some kind of fancy AI matrix thing or something like this, right? It seems to him that all the other people around him, he makes the assumption and that it seems to him to be the case. And this is what most people do with knowledge, right? It seems to people to be the case. It seems to be the case that other people are thinking. It seems to be the case that those are oranges and those are apples. It seems to be the case that's an oak tree and, you know, try to draw an oak tree here. And then, here's a pine tree over here. I mean, it seems to be the case that we know the distinction between these things. It seems to be the case that God exists. It seems to be the case that morality exists. But Descartes is in a quest for knowledge as an epistemologist. It's not enough just for things to seem to be the case. He wants to know that they're the case. So how can he venture from the seems to him to the knowing? He doesn't want to just things, oh, it seems like that's the case. He wants to know that it's the case. So how can he do this? How can he move from it seems to be the case to he knows that it's the case? So he wants to move from seeming to knowing so he can have wisdom. He can verify knowledge. So his venture here starts with lowercase g, God, which we've already established comes from the idea of perfect. And because part of perfection is being all good, which I guess I didn't mention before, but omnibenevolent. And omnibenevolent means all good. So we have God is something that exists, and God is creating this idea that we all have in our heads called perfect, which we've never experienced with our senses, but it must come from somewhere, and only something with as much commensurate reality can create this idea. And part of being perfect is being good, completely good. So if something is completely good, is it possible that it can be tricking us 24 hours a day? Making us, deceiving us 24 hours a day, making us think that other people exist when in fact they don't exist? And Descartes argues no. If this being does exist, and it seems to be the case that it does, because the idea of perfect has to come from something that is itself perfect, God is not capable of deceiving us in this way, making us think 24/7 that other people exist when in fact they don't exist, and making us think that maple trees are maple trees when in fact they're chickens, or God isn't capable of making us think that apples are oranges when they're actually, that apples are apples when in fact they're partridges. I mean, so Descartes continues and relates this to other things. So he thinks about math. So even math, he says, well, it is possible that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is also a trick. I mean, can I imagine that 2 plus 2 equals 4 actually equals 5? Sure, right? I can imagine that. I can imagine it. It's possible that it's a trick, that every time I see 2 plus 2 equals 4, it's actually an illusion. And there's actually 3 things instead of 2 things. And there's 3 plus 2 equals 5. But to me, it looks like 2 plus 2. So it is possible that even basic math is part of this trick. And Descartes calls this kind of the malignant demon hypothesis. That it is possible that there's this evil deity that exists and is tricking us all the time and creating a world full of illusion and making us think that other people exist and making us think that 2 plus 2 equals 4 when in fact it always equals 5, and making us think that chicken tastes like beef and corn tastes like fish, right? And corn actually tastes like fish, but we think corn tastes like corn. So this is called the malignant demon hypothesis. And so going back to what we set up here, Descartes thinks, well, if the idea of God exists, it has to come from something with as much commensurate reality. In other words, an actual God, and a perfect being. If we have the idea of perfect, a perfect being must exist. And if a perfect being must exist, it must be all good or omnibenevolent. And this perfect being undoes the malignant demon hypothesis. It dispels it. Because it's not possible for a perfect being who's all good to be tricking us 24 hours a day into thinking that 2 + 2 = 4 when it actually equals 5, and tricking us into thinking that other people exist when in fact they do not exist. So just from sitting in his chair, Descartes has shown that through rationalism, that he can know things. He can know that God exists. He can know that perfect exists. He can know that other people exist. And he can know that things like basic math exist. All from just thinking, sitting in his chair and thinking. And let me just clear the screen here. So this is the basis of Descartes' Cogito, Ergo, Sum, which many people think is I think, therefore I am, but it's actually I am thinking. If it's translated properly, therefore I exist. I am thinking, therefore I exist. Because no matter how, regardless of all that stuff we talked about, if the malignant demon hypothesis is true, and there's a world full of illusion out there, and basic math goes out the window, existence of other people goes out the window, there's one thing, no matter how evil this malignant demon may be, it can't convince you that you are thinking when in fact you're not thinking. So no matter how evil this thing may be, the fact that you are thinking means that you exist. It doesn't say how you exist. It doesn't mean you have a body. But it means you have a mind. And so for Descartes, this makes him a dualist, which we'll talk about in another video. But dualism is basically the belief that two entirely distinct substances exist in the universe. There's mind substance, and there's matter, or there's body substance. And these two substances they exist together and they interact with each other somehow. I mean, we'll talk about that in another video. So again, it doesn't mean you have a body. It just means you're thinking, therefore you exist. So at the very least, right now, without any of the other stuff we talked about, you're thinking right now. You can know that you exist somehow, somewhere. Doesn't mean you have a body. Doesn't mean you take up space. It just means you exist as mind substance. So that's the essence of rationalism. And I compared it to empiricism a little bit to give you an idea of the differences between them. Maybe in another video we'll go into some more details about empiricism. But that's basically it. That's basically Descartes' argument, the Cogito argument, what it means, where it comes from, what it leads to, um, and what are the implications for epistemology, so what we can know and how we know things, and if we can know things really at all. So hopefully this video has been interesting for you, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.